So how should you go about making a list from your 10th Cavalry Brigade collection? Let's take a look. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the story of the 10th Cavalry Brigade. Now, I am really sorry this video is a long time coming. I recorded this actually a few months back and somehow managed to delete it before editing it. So today we're going to go through the first of 3 videos that are going to cover kind of how to build some lists around your 10th Cavalry Brigade. Now, we're going to start today with what I'm going to call the smaller point lists. These are anything less than 1,000. And what I'm trying to do here is 2 things. First, I'm going to try to present what I think are some really strong lists, especially at the combat patrol level, and also try to help you prioritize your purchases for the your collection, so you can actually build a viable army on the table and get the maximum enjoyment out of it while you work your way toward the eventual point value goal. What, I don't know, 30,000 or something? Who knows? Anyway, so let's take a look at the table now and start with the simplest of the formats, the combat patrol format, which is a 450 point list with some restrictions which we'll get into in a moment. Alright, so today I'm going to start with what I think is the, well, admittedly it's my opinion, but I think it's the best target for your first combat patrol list for your collection. Your first 450 points should look like this. Now, caveat here, when it comes to this tank, you will have to do a little bit of modeling. Here's a little card to go to that link where I review the Vickers and how I went ahead and double charted it. There are some 3D prints out there that you can also use, but it really is the best option for a 450 point list. Now, I did use this and at Adepticon, and it did very well. Matter of fact, this has been many people who have seen this have commented that it's kind of mean, but it is not an overpowered list. It is not. It can handle things, but it's also, you know, a little fragile, like any combat patrol infantry platoon would be. And the tanks aren't all that much to write home about when it comes to dealing with, you know, being able to absorb damage. But, you know, for a combat patrol list, they're perfectly reasonable. Let's kind of go over it. Now, the very first thing, obviously you need a lieutenant, and he's going to be a veteran. Matter of fact, all of the infantry here are veteran, and the tanks and the the artillery are regular. That's how I built this list, and it works, in my opinion, very well. I've used this many, many, many times. So, to start with, we'll go with minimum size squads of your 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade sections. Again, both with a BAR added, and those are 83 points each veteran. So, with a 65 point second lieutenant, and then 2 83 point sections, minimum sized, you're starting to eat into your points pretty quick. Of course, with the combat patrol, I want to kind of talk now about the format itself, at least the format around Adepticon. The rules are as follows. You can only have 450 points with an 8 dice cap. No armor can be greater than 8 plus. Even if you have like a Stuart that is normally 8 plus but gets that +1 from the front, so it's 9, that is disallowed. You can't use that in combat patrol. The maximum armor facing on any side can be only 8, which means anti-tank rifles will work. Light howitzers can serve as an anti-tank device as well. Now, in this combat patrol, it's got its own platoon selector, and in it you get an armored car as well as a tank, and of course you get your mortar, your machine gun, your lieutenant, your 2 mandatory infantry. You have 3 more infantry, and a tank team, and artillery team. So it's a very typical generic platoons format, just skinny down a little bit. You only have 1 flamethrower, and none of them can be vehicle flamethrower. Obviously, you're not going to have to deal with that with the early war poles at this point. So that's why the anti-tank rifle fits in pretty well, and as a veteran team, it's only 39 points. That rounds out your infantry, gives you 3 units that I think are pretty good at holding objectives, because again, the veterans are hard to displace. A veteran's small team in cover is hard to kill, especially if he's able to go down near an objective or hunker down near an objective. He could actually hold an objective for you while your other infantry assault the enemy to take other positions. Now the tankette is only the medium machine gun tankette, because most of the things you're going to face are going to be infantry and soft skin. You have other ways to deal with the any armored, but I'll talk about that in a second. The medium machine gun gives you 2 things here. Because it's mounted in a tankette, it's very hard to kill. The only thing that can hurt it, obviously, is an anti-tank weapon, but because it has the recce ability, you're going to force the opponent to either shoot at it and waste the shot as you recce away, which is a perfectly valid use for that tankette, since it only has the medium machine gun, or he's going to have to dedicate his anti-armor to shoot at it instead of your tank. So it gives your opponent what I call a dilemma. What do I prioritize? Which piece of armor does my anti-tank asset focus on? They're both dangerous. This can zip ahead and pretty much ignore anything that's going to shoot at it, except anti-tank. Unlike a lot of armored cars, which have an open top rule in early war, having the ability to recce allows you to move up near the end of a turn for example, into a forest. And if you're targeted by something anti-tank, you simply reverse 4.5 inches till you're outside the forest, dense terrain, and now the opponent can't see you. But you really haven't lost much distance, so it puts a lot of pressure on your opponent that way. And of course, if he leaves it alone, it can race around and not be hurt by any of his infantry. And it's not going to stick around in one place, so mortars aren't likely to hurt it, unless they get really lucky. So tankette's a very viable option here. Now, because the 10th Cavalry Brigade did not use any armored cars, you're kind of limited to the tankette as your armored car slot. Now, as far as the tank, Vickers is your only choice for the 10th Cavalry Brigade. And I prefer the 35 or 55 point twin turret, the A model or A turret model, because with this you have 2 separate turrets. You can put pins on 2 separate units. Pinning, as you know, in both angles is extremely important. Every little bit helps, and that is 10 machine guns. This is a 55 point model, which is only a little bit more expensive than the Germans' motorcycle sidecar, which is their medium machine gun. This, by the way, is 70 points compared to I think it's 40 for the motorcycle sidecar, which take up the same slot. But here, you're putting down 10 shots instead of 6 at 2 different targets instead of the one the Germans get. If you compare this to a Panzer I, it's going to fire its 12 shots at 1 target, whereas you can fire your 10 at 2 different targets, 5 and 5. And being able to pin multiple units during your turn is useful, okay, when it shoots, right? So that's why I prefer it. Again, most of your opponents are going to have soft skin or infantry. And if you really need to deal with the armor, in my opinion, and again, that's why I built the list this way, I decided to go with the howitzer, light howitzer, instead of the anti-tank gun. Simply because this does 2 things. First of all, because it's a 2+, regardless of range, you're guaranteed to cause pins on any armored vehicle you hit, and you'll glance on a 6 for any 8+ armor that's out there. If you happen to get a side shot, or you're hitting an armored car, with 7+ armored car, you're glancing on 5s. It'll tear up soft skin, it'll tear up infantry. You kill veterans on 3+. So there's a lot to be said about that howitzer. If you were to take just the anti-tank gun, the Bofors anti-tank gun gives you, granted, a lot more hitting power when it comes to taking out that 1 or maybe 2 armored units in the opponent's list, but you can't whittle down the enemy infantry as fast because you only have a single 1-inch template. And yes, it only does +1 pen. That's okay. You're killing veterans on 4s. With a 2-inch template and a +2 pen, you're going to kill a lot more veteran infantry models a lot quicker with the howitzer. In addition, your howitzer can fire indirectly at things over 24 inches, which is good in the beginning of the game when some of your shots may be obstructed, and you're likely to be hitting on 6s anyway. So you might as well fire an indirect shot, and then as things close in, you can put this on ambush. HE shell, it's going to be able to hurt anything on the board. If you have a anti-tank gun on the board, you have to choose whether it's an HE round or an anti-tank round, and that gives your opponent clues of what he can move and not move. You decide to put an anti-tank round in your anti-tank gun, the opponent can move his infantry up without worrying to spring the ambush on him. If you load a HE, the opponent's going to feel no fear at all bringing up his armor vehicles. So that's why I consider this probably your best starting point, the best approach. Now, a really quick review, because the way this is going to have to be put together, you're going to get units from Gorgon Studios. That would be these models here, this NCO, this NCO. Of course, you can use the NCOs out of the Warlord packs, so 2 Warlord squads. This is the French 75 gun with the motorized tires. And then these guys are all from Gorgon Studios. Of course, these are Warlord models, and like I said, the card earlier, you'll be able to take a look and see what it takes to make that dual turret tank. Alright, so there's a 450 point list, 7 dice. It's actually 445 points, and it works really well. It's very durable. But let's say you want to go with 8 dice. One way to do that is there's actually a couple ways to do that. And let's just use this one as an example. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to make everything here regular except the light howitzer. Now this is where we depart a little bit from the history of, in my opinion, the history of the unit, right? Remember earlier when I was talking about the howitzer artillery unit and the infantry units, I was talking about their heritage, and the motorized artillery was kind of formed in the 30s, so it didn't really have a pedigree, if you will, a combat pedigree, whereas the infantry unit, the 10th motorized rifles, 10th Mounted Rifles and the 24th Uhlans had some veterans from the World War I and the Polish-Soviet War. So some of them even had combat experience, some of their veterans in there. So these could be veteran. Well, here we're flipping it on its head. But that's for a game, right? But anyway, this allows the howitzer to stick around longer because, again, 5s to kill, 6s if it goes through the gun shield. They're going to be passing their test more quickly, or more often, and they're going to be surviving shots more often. Your opponent will be more likely to take out your anti-tank rifle, but that's the trade-off you're doing here. But you get an extra die because what you're going to do is you're going to add in a single marksman. Now, the 10th Cavalry Brigade didn't really use, snipers, marksmen kind of things. I'm sure they could have, but they're a motorized unit, and in the actions they actually fought, they were mobile. They didn't necessarily have engage with snipers, but there were several other units in the area that Maciek was given command of to support his defense, his orders. They were there was a KOP regiment or battalion. There was a National Guard, an ON battalion, and there were a couple different groups of regular Polish Army regiments and divisions that came in as stragglers. And any one of those can provide you the marksman. Now this again is a regular, so he's only 40 points. Being that these are both 40 points, they're a small team, they're hard to hit, that's useful. But at least now you have 8 dice. It's a little more fragile, a little harder to use in that sense, but it's one way about it. Another way to go to 8 dice is not using the marksman. Instead, you go ahead and you swap out your howitzer for the anti-tank gun, and you give yourself a medium machine gun. Now again here, everything is regular except for the anti-tank rifle team. That remains regular veteran, because if something happens to this is your only anti-tank response. So it's make them hard to take out. They can threaten from the side more often because this is much less mobile, and the opponent can keep their front armor facing them. Of course, at short range, it's glancing on a 4, long range glancing on a 5, so this is a serious threat compared to this. But that would be an 8 dice, 444 point list, whereas both the other lists were 445 points. This one gives you the 8 dice. Again, it's fragile because it's regular, and you've got to be careful on how you actually use it. But those are some ways to go about it. So if you really like the Bofors gun and don't want to go to the hassle of buying the French gun, go ahead and get the Bofors, and you're good to go. As far as the artillery goes, machine gun from Cromlech. Now, Cromlech currently, as a recording of this video, doesn't have these in stock. They're in the process of reworking their line, but they are going to continue with the Polish line of models. So do not be discouraged if you go to their site and don't see these models right now. So that's your combat patrol. Now, again, the key here is that your opponent has a limit on his armor that he can take, 7+, and he can only take 3 vehicles: 1 armored car, 1 tank, and a tow that could be armored. Think of Bren Carrier, for example. So there are things the opponent can do that will require some of these anti-tank capabilities. But now there are some 500-point combat patrol formats. No, I don't know. I don't play them in Adepticon. I know the Adepticon used to have a 500-point threshold. Now let's take a look at what that would look like. Alright, so again, we're starting with the 500-point combat patrol list. And again, the rules haven't changed for the combat patrol. Still maximum armor values and maximum. You can't have any HE that's 3 or higher, larger than 2 inches, things like that. And this doesn't look much different than your 400-point list. However, there are some changes here. Now this is 495 points. What we did is we took one of the 450 list and we made the officer, the anti-tank rifle team, and the 2 infantry squads veteran, which makes them much more survivable. But we left the medium machine gun as regular at 50 points. We've kept the light howitzer in there as regular, and of course the vehicles in their machine gun configurations are 70 points for the tankette, 55 points for the Vickers. That gives you a good all-around force, again, to test yourself against combat patrol opponents. This is designed for systems or games where the maximum enemy armor value can be 8, okay? Nothing higher. That's how this will work. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the medium machine gun, and that's a very fair point. So, in a combat patrol, this is 8 dice. You can simply throw in a mortar. Mortars are useful, especially if the opponent has an anti-tank gun sitting around. This will give him pressure so that his anti-tank gun is not as likely to take out your tankette or your tank. So, very good thing to keep kind of not in reserve, but in your hip pocket as an option here. 495 points, 8 dice. It's a pretty good group of models. Now, I prefer this being veteran because the units will last longer. You can shave more points off by making all the infantry regular and then maybe getting another unit here or there, but I don't think you get as much. And remember, most combat patrols have an 8 dice cap. So, again, trying to stay within that, you might as well use the veterans where possible. If you were to get rid of the veteran off of these, you could add more men if you wanted to. Essentially, if these were into regular, you'd be able to add 2 men to each squad. And as a matter of fact, if you went from veteran down to regular for him, you could give him his assistant. Personally, I prefer running the veterans, but it's entirely up to you. It's your list, right? But again, when you go from Combat Patrol 450 to the 500, really you're only adding the mortar or medium machine gun to your collection. That's pretty good. But let's talk about the truth that not all 500-point games are Combat Patrol. Alright, now not all games that are at 500-point level are going to be Combat Patrol. You can have a perfectly normal 500-point game with no limits on armor values, stuff like that. But if you're going to do that, you need better anti-tank equipment, and you need it in redundancy. So, you're going to sacrifice dice, but again, if your opponent's going to bring some of that, he's going to be sacrificing dice. He'll usually have 5 or 6 dice in a 500-point list, and you're going to have 6 dice in a 500-point list, at least with this approach. Now, again, to try to keep things survivable, all the infantry are veteran, the artillery and vehicles are regular. But it's a 493-point list, and we went ahead and added a body or lookout to the officer to make him a little more survivable. Obviously left the tankette as is, added a man to this squad and 2 to this one to make them yet more survivable, especially when it comes to holding objectives. Got rid of the howitzer and went with that anti-tank gun, because if you're going to try to deal with 9+ armor, you need an anti-tank gun, not an anti-tank rifle, and not a 2-inch howitzer, because that light howitzer cannot put pins on the enemy armor if it's a 9+ if they shoot from the front. That means you're going to have to indirectly fire and hit them from the top or hit them from the side, and the opponent, if he's smart, is not going to let you do that. So your howitzer is not going to be useful against the armor at all, meaning you need something. Obviously you can use the tank as an anti-tank gun, but if that gets penned, because remember, this is only a 7+ tank, it's going to get popped pretty easily, unless you're careful. So you need a backup, and if this gets focused on, that can back up for it. Now, fortunately, the tank has a coaxial medium machine gun, so it can do stuff to infantry as well as, once it deals with the enemy tank. So this is a good way to go with your your 500-point list with no restrictions on what you can bring. The only addition you've made is the turret. But remember, if you followed my instructions on how to convert this model into the A turret with the 2 machine guns, you have this model. It's just a matter of swapping the turrets like I did. The only other thing you've added is your anti-tank gun. Of course, if you had the anti-tank gun in your, in your other list, your 450 Combat Patrol list instead of your howitzer, well then, great. It's good you had that. You already had it. You didn't really have to add much. You just really added bodies, made them vet, and I went ahead and put the anti-tank gun on there to give yourself the 400 or 500-point list. So again, that's 493 points, and that's a pretty solid list. I really would hesitate to make any changes to this because I'm afraid of dealing with those Panzer IVs, especially Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs. That's what I'm most likely going to run up. And if you happen to get a French who likes to bring his, large, heavy tanks, then you're going to need some anti-tank guns. British, you're mostly dealing with 8+ armor anyway with the early war. And if you're playing mixed eras, well, there's plenty of 9+ armor out there, so you're going to want the 2 guns. So this is where I go. Now, I would be very interested in your comments about how you could make this list improved. Again, 500-point max to be able to handle the regular 9+ armor, maybe even 10, in a 500-point list. What do you guys think? Now, we're not going to stop here, though. We're going to talk about 750-point lists. But things change a little bit in this next section. Alright, so 750 points, this is where you get some real meat. Again, there are no restrictions, so anything goes. And that's where things get a little bit difficult for the 10th Cavalry Brigade. Polish in general, but 10th Cavalry Brigade specifically. If you're trying to stick with the history, just with what's in the unit. So what I've got here is my initial basically a 750 point list. It's actually 745 points. And it starts with a second lieutenant with his bodyguard, veteran. Then we have three 7-man sections with a BAR, all veteran. We went ahead and added a medium machine gun and a medium mortar as veteran, an anti-tank rifle as veteran, then a light anti-tank gun as regular, the regular tankette with a medium machine gun, and a regular Vickers with a AT gun and coax. Very similar to the 500 point list. Again, going with veteran to allow you to maximize the survivability of the units. I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but again, remember trying to build your collection slowly, because this is now 3 separate kits you need to buy from Warlord or Cromwell, whoever you're going to buy these things from for your sections. You'll need to add the other machine gun or mortar, whichever one you didn't use in your combat patrol. If you were using your light howitzer in combat patrol, well, now you got to buy the anti-tank gun. We already talked about the dual role of this particular Vickers model. The rest you already have. So this is an incremental add to your collection, but it's not too much. And again, trying to keep around 10 order dice. Now you can go further if you wanted to, and I'll talk about how you might want to play with the numbers a little bit. Because again, once you get to 750, things really become kind of up to you, really. There's less right answers and wrong answers. Not that any of the previous lists were quote the right answer, but you definitely have certain mixes that give you the maximum flexibility. Here you have a lot of options. Okay, you can remove these and add another infantry section. You can go down to regular on all these and add more models or more sections. There's a lot you can do, but let's talk about using the 745 points, 10 order dice, with the way we set it up here. So again, veterans make it easier to survive. Tankette role is unchanged. Again, because you're likely going to be going up against normal 9+ armor, you need 2 separate solid anti-tank units. And both of these will go, and this is most likely going to be what your opponent's going to target first. And when this pops, you need to have the backup. So, of course, your opponent's going to have, most likely, the same situation with an anti-tank gun and a tank that can deal damage to your tank vehicles. Remember, the Panzer IV, with its light howitzer, can take out that Vickers without too much difficulty. It glances on a 5. To front armor, and because of the side armor's vulnerability on that, it's going to be glancing on not 4s but 3s. So you need that second anti-tank gun. So this is one way of approaching it. Now, as an alternative, if you really wanted to, you can kind of switch up the way some of the particulars between the units. So, for example, let's say you wanted to do some additional heavy hitting with infantry and light armor. You could swap out the tankette with a 20mm cannon. Now you have some solid anti-infantry capability plus some anti-light armor. Like anything, with that being an autocannon of 2+ pen, you're going to be able to deal with all the 7+ armor that's out there and a lot of the 8s as well. And 8s from the front short range or 8s from the side at any range, you're going to be able to pin and potentially knock out. So and of course it still has the recce rule, so your opponent can easily waste a shot as a result. So not a bad way, but in order to add the 20 points that requires, you need to then make some other tweaks. So you're going to need to drop the quality on your infantry, at least the medium machine gun and the medium mortar, to regular, and your anti-tank team, anti-tank rifle team, to regular. That'll give you the room, but you'll also have enough room to add one more infantry model to any one of these squads. So let's go ahead and put him right here. Okay. So now you're going to have an 8-man squad and 2 7-man squads. Now all of these 3 squads are veterans at this point, so you haven't given up much survivability for being able to, upgun the tank head. Now if you wanted to, you can again go with regular units. Now they're starting to get very large, so they become a little more survivable, and you can potentially add yet another model to the other units. Matter of fact, if you were to get rid of, make all 3 of these regular, you could add another 6-man regular unit with a BAR. So that'd be 11 order dice. Not too shabby, in all honesty. That's one way to deal with it. Now, what you can do here, this is one of the things I like about the 10th Cavalry Brigade being a unit that operated in conjunction with others, and it wasn't a lot of the traditional units. They worked with the Border Protection Corps, the KOP, and the National Guard, basically the National Guard, which is the ON. Both of those units can be represented in here, as well as regular Polish infantry that would be the stragglers that were kind of helping the line hold in the region. So we don't have to stick with just the 10th Cavalry Brigade here. We can expand ourselves a little bit more. So if we wanted to, we can start moving around to add some of these other units. So let's take a look at only one example of how we can incorporate one of those units. Alright, so in this version of my 750 point list, I have chosen to stick with 10 order dice, and I've kept all the 10th Cavalry Brigade infantry veteran, left the vehicles and artillery regular, took out the 20mm autocannon, put back the medium machine gun on the tankette, but then incorporated an inexperienced infantry squad. Now you could use something to represent the Border Protection Corps, but the Border Protection Corps that was actually fighting with the 10th Cavalry Brigade were much better trained and experienced than an inexperienced infantry squad. So, but this can represent the ON, essentially the National Guard unit. Now, unfortunately for them, the National Guard units did not have a lot of heavy weapons. Matter of fact, they didn't even have uniforms, all of them. Some of them had their old uniforms from back when they had been in the service, but the vast majority didn't. And one of the things they did to compensate for that is everyone got a red and white armband. That was their uniform. That red and white armband, you're probably used to seeing that in relation to anything dealing with the Polish resistance, but it actually had its origin well before that, before the beginning of the war, and it is predominantly with the National Guard. So we have a 10-man National Guard squad with a BAR, and those are inexperienced. Now the reason I'd go ahead and use them is because they're great at holding objectives. I don't know if you've seen any of the history, or sorry, in the series, in Clash of Heroes, the first season. Dave got really annoyed with how that ON squad would constantly be going down and holding an objective, and he couldn't whittle them down because being down made them a lot harder to kill. So it did its job. In a 750 point list, you're dealing with objectives. That's one way to securely hold one of your own objectives. Now, of course, no guarantee. It is an experience, and we'll take casualties to our artillery and to being charged, but that's just the risk you're going to take. Now, of course, you can also remove both of these units and put a regular infantry squad in to represent maybe the Border Protection Corps. That's an entirely legitimate addition. You'll lose an order die, you're down to 9, but it's some flexibility. There are a lot of things you can do, but you have to make a decision whether you're going to move in the direction of sticking with the historical 10th Cavalry Brigade units, or are you going to go ahead and expand it to include the units under which that were under Maciek's command during the 2 weeks that he defended the this Carpathian mountain region around Krakow and Rzeszów and those areas. Your choice entirely. But you have a lot of options, and here in this particular case, the only difference between this and the others is you've added to your collection a unique unit. If you don't have that unit, you don't want that unit, then again, stick with the 10th Cavalry Brigade and just add additional models as we discussed earlier. Alright, one last thing. Now I can't actually do this particular list because I don't have it in my collection, but I want to show you what you could do if you were to buy yet a 4th infantry squad from Warlord Games or whomever. You can now, instead of having everything vet like we did before, you leave the officer and his anti-tank rifleman as vet, and your 3 squads go to regular, as well as your mortar and heavy machine gun or medium machine gun. Once those are all regular, you have enough unit points to buy another 7-man regular unit with a BAR. Now you have 11 order dice, and that is a pretty solid force. Again, if you manage it right, and dice don't roll against you, but you also you now have a TKS with the 20mm autocannon. So again, there's some heavy hitting power there available to you. So that's another option for a 750 point list. Tell me what you guys think. Again, this is what I can do in my collection versus, like I said, except for this particular list, everything else I can do. And now next time we'll talk about all the different options, the ways to approach a 1,000 point list. Alright, thanks for sticking with me. Share, like, and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.